This happened during a solo camping trip I took in the Sierra Nevada mountains about 10 years ago. I'm an experienced backpacker, and I relish the solitude. For this trip, I had hiked about 15 miles off the nearest access road to a small, pristine alpine lake that I had all to myself. The first day and night were pure bliss. The silence, the stars, the clean air. It was exactly what I needed. The second afternoon, I was fishing from the shore when I got that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, the "you're being watched" feeling. I slowly scanned the area. The lake was surrounded by a dense pine forest on 3 sides, and on the fourth, a steep, rocky ridge rose up about 500 feet. At first, I saw nothing. Then, I caught a flicker of movement on the ridge. There were 2 figures standing up there, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky. They were too far away to make out any details, but they were clearly human. I gave them a friendly wave, the way you do with fellow hikers. They didn't wave back. They just stood there, perfectly still, watching me. It was a little odd, but I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just enjoying the view. I went back to fishing, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. Every few minutes, I'd glance up at the ridge. They were always there, still, silent. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, I started to get genuinely unnerved. There was no discernible trail up or down that ridge, and it would be treacherous to navigate in the dark. Surely they would have to leave soon. They didn't. I made my dinner by my campfire, the flickering light making me feel a little less exposed. Every time I looked, their 2 dark shapes were still there, like statues carved into the mountain. I finally retreated into my tent, my heart pounding a little faster than it should have. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the image of them. Who would stand on a cold, windy ridge for hours, just watching a stranger's campsite? I slept poorly, waking at every snap of a twig. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, I looked up at the ridge. They were gone. A wave of relief washed over me. I laughed at myself, calling myself paranoid. I decided to enjoy my last day and packed up my gear to do some exploring around the lake. As I was circling the far side of the lake, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, in a patch of soft mud near the water's edge, were 2 sets of footprints. They were barefoot. The prints were fresh, leading out of the dense woods, down to the water, and then back into the trees. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. I followed the tracks for about 20 feet into the forest, and that's where I found the indentations in the dirt. It was the distinct impression of 2 people having knelt there, side by side, for a very long time. The ground was packed down, the knee prints deep and obvious. From that spot, they would have had a perfect, concealed view of my campsite across the lake. They hadn't just been on the ridge, they had been much, much closer. I abandoned the rest of my exploration. I packed up my camp in a frenzy, constantly looking over my shoulder, and hiked the 15 miles back to my car without stopping. I never saw them again, but I can't forget those 2 silent figures on the ridge, or the barefoot prints by the water. They weren't hikers. They were something else entirely. My girlfriend, Chloe, and I are avid rock climbers and canyoneers. We love exploring the remote slot canyons of Utah. This particular story comes from a trip to a lesser-known canyon that required a long off-road drive and a multi-hour hike just to get to the entrance. By the time we rappelled into the canyon mouth, we knew we were the only souls for dozens of miles. The canyon was beautiful and eerie. The walls were hundreds of feet high, sculpted by water into smooth, flowing curves. In most places, it was only a few feet wide, and the sun rarely reached the sandy floor, keeping it cool and silent. The silence in a place like that is profound. You can hear your own heartbeat. We were about a mile in when, just for fun, I let out a loud whoop. I waited for the echo, but nothing came back. The soft sandstone walls seemed to just absorb the sound. Chloe laughed and did the same, a high-pitched hello. Again, only silence. We continued on for another half an hour, deeper into the earth. We stopped for a water break, sitting in absolute quiet. And then we heard it. From somewhere far behind us, back the way we came, a perfect replica of my whoop echoed through the canyon. We looked at each other, confused. "I thought you said there was no echo," Chloe whispered, her voice suddenly small. "There isn't," I whispered back. "That was delayed. Really delayed." It was strange, but we tried to rationalize it. Maybe some weird acoustic fluke of the canyon's geometry. We waited, listening. A minute later, we heard a high-pitched hello, a perfect imitation of Chloe's call. Now we were officially creeped out. It wasn't an echo. An echo doesn't wait a full minute to return. It felt like something was following us, mocking us. We packed our things and started moving faster, the fun of the adventure completely gone, replaced by a cold knot of dread. Every so often we would stop and listen, and every time we would hear it. A cough we had made minutes earlier, the scuff of my boot against a rock, the metallic clink of a carabiner on my harness. Everything was repeated, perfectly, from somewhere behind us in the darkness. It was a flawless mimicry, but always on a delay of several minutes, as if it were following us at a set distance. The worst part was when we stopped talking. The silence stretched. We walked for maybe 20 minutes without making a sound, just the soft crunch of our boots on the sand. We strained our ears, expecting to hear nothing. Then, from the darkness behind us, came the soft crunch of boots on sand. We didn't wait to see what it was. We ran. We scrambled over rocks and waded through pools of stagnant water, our only thought to get to the canyon's exit. We didn't stop, didn't look back until we were finally out in the blinding sunlight. We never went back, and I can't explain what was in that canyon with us. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a human. It was just a sound, a perfect mimicry that followed us through the silent darkness. My grandfather was a timber cruiser in the Pacific Northwest for 40 years. His job was to go deep into tracts of wilderness, often alone for weeks at a time, and survey the trees for logging companies. He was as comfortable in the woods as most people are in their own living rooms. He had dozens of strange stories, but this is the one that he only told once, and it was clear it had shaken him to his core. He was surveying a huge, unlogged valley in northern Washington in the 1970s. It was incredibly remote, and he had been helicoptered in. He'd been out for about a week when a deep fog rolled in, a common occurrence in that area. The fog was so thick he could barely see 50 feet in front of him, so he decided to hunker down in his small tent and wait it out. After a few hours, he started to hear a sound through the fog. It was a low, rhythmic chanting. It wasn't Native American, he said, and it wasn't any language he could recognize. It was guttural and repetitive. He grabbed his rifle, his heart pounding, and peered out of his tent. He couldn't see anything in the thick white soup. The chanting seemed to come from all directions at once. He sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the disembodied sound. Finally, it stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed was somehow even more terrifying. Just as he was starting to relax, a figure emerged from the fog. My grandfather said it was a man, or at least shaped like one. He was tall and unnaturally thin, but the strangest thing was what he was wearing. He was covered from head to toe in what looked like a suit made of living moss, leaves, and strips of bark. It wasn't a ghillie suit for camouflage. It looked like the foliage was growing on him. His face was pale and indistinct, with long, dark hair matted with dirt and leaves. He held no weapon. The man walked slowly and deliberately to the edge of my grandfather's camp, just outside the ring of his fire pit. And then he stopped. He stood there, completely motionless, and stared at my grandfather's tent. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared. My grandfather, a man who had faced down bears and cougars, was frozen in absolute terror. He said there was an aura of profound wrongness about the man, something ancient and deeply hostile. He kept his rifle trained on the figure, but he couldn't bring himself to fire. The man in the moss suit stood there for the rest of the day. As dusk fell and the fog began to glow with the fading light, he remained. My grandfather didn't sleep. He sat awake all night, watching the unmoving silhouette at the edge of his camp. Just before dawn, without a sound, the figure turned and walked back into the fog, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. My grandfather waited until the fog had completely burned off. He then packed up only what he absolutely needed, leaving his tent and other gear behind. He hiked to his emergency extraction point 2 days early and called for the helicopter. He never went back to that valley and refused to ever speak of the incident again after telling my father that one time. He didn't know if the man was a ghost, a hermit, or some kind of spirit of the woods. All he knew was that it was the only time in his life he felt he was in the presence of something that was not meant to be seen by humans.